The alarm tore through the bridge before I even understood what it meant. Red light washed over every console, and my hands moved faster than my mind could think. I am Vexthal Corin, sensor officer aboard the Kethrin scout vessel Windrunner, and in that single moment, every instrument in front of me seemed to be lying. The numbers made no sense at all. A mass reading larger than 3 of our warships combined had appeared out of nowhere, sitting quietly at the edge of a colony system we had only been sent to check on. My throat went dry. I called out to my captain before I had even finished processing what my own screen was showing me. Captain Doran Vale leaned over my shoulder, his 4 eyes narrowing at the display in front of us. "Explain that number to me again," he said, his voice low and controlled, though I could hear the tension hiding just beneath it. "I cannot explain it," I admitted. "The gravitational signature is far too large. It should not be possible for a single object to hold that much mass and still be moving under its own power, not without tearing itself apart. We had been sent to this system, a quiet border world called New Haven Colony, after a distress signal cut off in the middle of transmission. Our orders were simple enough: investigate a suspected pirate raid, confirm the safety of the colonists, and report back to Coalition Command. Routine. Almost boring, if I am honest. My crewmates had joked about it during the flight out, saying we would probably find nothing more than a burned-out cargo hauler and a few frightened settlers hiding inside a storm shelter. Nobody on this ship expected what we found instead. The colony itself was small, home to only a few thousand settlers, mostly humans who had signed trade agreements with the wider galactic community only a handful of years earlier. Humanity was still new to us in every sense that mattered. Not new in the way of a species recently discovered, but new in the sense that nobody within the Coalition had ever truly seen what they were capable of. They kept to themselves, traded fairly, and answered distress calls whenever asked, never once boasting about anything resembling military strength. Many species within the loose alliance of star nations I served under had come to consider humanity harmless, quiet upstarts who had simply gotten lucky with early faster-than-light travel. I confess that I believed that too, once, though it embarrasses me now to admit it, given everything I would witness only a short time later. "Distance to the anomaly?" Captain Vale asked, his voice steady despite the way his tail flicked nervously behind him. 200,000 kilometers, and closing, I replied, watching the numbers shift across my display in slow, deliberate increments. "Whatever it is, it does not appear to be moving toward us. It seems to be holding a fixed position near the colony's main shipping lane." The bridge fell quiet, except for the low hum of our own engines working steadily beneath the deck plating. I glanced at my fellow officers and saw the same confusion mirrored on every face. We were not a large ship. The Windrunner carried a modest crew of 40, built for reconnaissance and light defense, never designed to face anything truly dangerous head-on. "Sir," said Lieutenant Arnos from the communications station, her voice tight with barely restrained nerves, "we are picking up a transmission. It is on an open frequency, not encrypted at all, and it is definitely not coming from the colony." "Let me hear it," Vale ordered at once. The voice that came through the speakers was calm, almost bored, speaking in accented but perfectly clear Coalition trade language. "This is Captain Liam Hart of the Titan-class vessel Iron Horizon, responding to a distress call from New Haven Colony. Unidentified scout ship, please confirm your designation and your intentions. We are currently assessing a situation here, and we would appreciate you not getting in the way while we do." The words themselves were polite enough on their surface. It was the tone underneath them that unsettled me most. There was no fear in it, no urgency, nothing suggesting the speaker considered our presence any kind of meaningful concern. It was the tone one might use speaking to a neighbor who had wandered too close while tending a garden, not the tone of a warship captain addressing an unknown vessel inside a tense and uncertain system. Captain Vale motioned for Arnos to open a return channel. "This is Captain Doran Vale of the Coalition scout vessel Windrunner. We were dispatched to investigate a distress signal originating from this colony. State your business here, human vessel." There was a brief pause before the reply finally came. Same business as you, it seems. Except we got here first, and we are already handling it. I would suggest you hold your position and let us work. Things are about to get a little loud around here." I looked toward my captain, uncertain what to make of that particular phrase. Get a little loud. It sounded almost casual, like a warning about noisy machinery, rather than any kind of combat engagement. I turned back to my sensors, trying to build a clearer picture of the massive objects sitting quietly within the system, and began cross-referencing every database available to my station, searching for anything resembling a Titan-class vessel within Coalition archives. I found almost nothing useful. A few scattered mentions buried inside older trade reports, vague descriptions offered by merchants who claimed to have seen one from a great distance and described it only as large, humbling, and unnervingly quiet. No specifications, no armament details, no combat history on record. It was as if humanity had built something enormous and simply never chosen to reveal what it could truly do. "Sir, I am getting a partial visual now," said Ensign Core from the observation station, her voice tight with something close to disbelief. "You are going to want to see this." The main view screen shifted, and the image that filled it took my breath away in a way I am not ashamed to describe honestly. The iron horizon was not simply large, it was staggering. Its hull stretched for what our scanners eventually confirmed to be just over 4 kilometers in length, plated in a dark material that seemed to absorb the surrounding starlight rather than reflect it. Along its surface, faint lines of soft light pulsed slowly, almost like veins carrying something alive beneath heavy armor. Weapon emplacements dotted its flanks in every direction, most currently dormant, though a few glowed faintly with a quiet readiness that made my stomach tighten. It did not look like a warship built for spectacle. It looked built for purpose, every visible angle serving some function I could not begin to guess at. "That cannot possibly be real," someone whispered behind me, though I could not tell exactly who had spoken. I ran the numbers again, quietly hoping for a different result. The power output alone, even at minimal operating levels, dwarfed our entire scout squadron combined. 3 additional Coalition vessels had been assigned to this same patrol route, though they remained hours away. Even added together, our combined forces would have looked like little more than children's toys standing beside that ship. Captain Vale straightened his posture, and I could see him working hard to maintain composure in front of the watching crew. "Options," he said quietly, more to himself than to any of us directly. "We could withdraw now and simply report back what we have seen." "Sir," I said, hesitating only briefly before continuing, "I do not believe withdrawal is necessary just yet." Their tone was not hostile toward us. If anything, they seemed almost dismissive of us as any kind of threat, rather than openly aggressive. "That is somehow less comforting than if they had been aggressive," Vale muttered under his breath. Before he could settle on any final course of action, new readings suddenly flooded my console without warning. Multiple contacts, smaller than the massive Titan vessel but still sizable in their own right, had appeared on the far side of the colony's main shipping lane. My pulse quickened sharply as I identified the incoming signatures. Raider-class vessels, at least a dozen of them by my initial count, moving together in an aggressive formation directly toward a cluster of unarmed colony transports attempting to flee the system entirely. "Captain, we have a genuine threat forming," I said quickly, my voice rising with urgency. "Pirate vessels, likely Skarn raiders based on their engine signatures, moving to intercept the colonist transports." Vale's expression hardened instantly. "Then perhaps now we finally see what that giant ship is actually built for." I kept my eyes locked on my display, heart pounding as the situation unfolded faster than I could track. The colonist transports, slow-moving and unarmed, had no realistic chance of outrunning the raiders now bearing down on them. I had witnessed skirmishes before during my years of service, and I knew how quickly things could turn tragic when civilians were caught helplessly in the crossfire. My hands tightened on the edge of my console without my even noticing. But the iron horizon did not move. Not at first, anyway. It simply sat there, massive and unnervingly still, as the raider vessels closed the distance toward the fleeing transports. I frowned at my display, wondering briefly if the enormous ship had somehow failed to notice the threat, though that seemed impossible, given what I had already witnessed. Then, almost lazily, a single section of the Titan's hull shifted, panels sliding open along one flank to reveal something I had no name for. It did not fire immediately. It simply waited, as though giving the raiders every chance to reconsider before it was too late. "They are giving them a chance to turn away," I said aloud, surprised by my own quiet realization. "A chance," Vale repeated, disbelief coloring every word. "Against that many hostiles, and they are still giving them a chance to simply leave first." I did not answer him, too deeply focused on the unfolding scene ahead of us. The raiders did not take the chance they had been offered. Their formation tightened instead, weapons charging rapidly as they closed the final distance toward the transports, clearly intent on either boarding the vessels or destroying the fleeing colonists outright rather than retreating while they still could. I felt a tight knot forming somewhere deep in my chest, a strange and uncomfortable mixture of dread and morbid curiosity, wondering exactly what that quiet, patient ship intended to do next. The comm channel crackled once again, Captain Hart's voice returning, still carrying that same unsettling, almost gentle calm. "Windrunner, you may want to keep your people well back from the shipping lane for the next few minutes. This should not take very long at all." Captain Vale ordered our own vessel to reverse thrusters immediately, putting further distance between us and the developing confrontation ahead, though I could tell from his rigid posture that curiosity was fighting hard against caution somewhere deep in his mind. I understood that feeling completely, because I felt it too. Every instinct told me to look away, to focus only on my duties and simply let the humans handle their own affairs quietly. Yet I found myself utterly unable to tear my attention from the display in front of me, waiting anxiously to see exactly what would happen next. Somewhere beneath the fear building in my chest, a smaller, quieter part of me had already begun to suspect that everything I thought I understood about the balance of power in this region of the galaxy was about to be proven completely wrong. The old rumors, the dismissive jokes my crewmates had made for years about humanity's supposed luck rather than genuine strength, all of it suddenly felt foolish and premature. I glanced toward my captain, hoping to find reassurance in his expression, but found only the same uncertain tension I felt inside myself. Whatever was about to happen in the space between that colony and those pirate vessels, I understood, without fully being able to explain why, that our small ship was about to witness something that would change the way every species within the coalition thought about humanity forever. And somewhere inside that quiet realization, buried beneath the fear, I felt something else stir as well. A grim, uncomfortable curiosity that refused to let me look away, no matter how much simpler it would have been to close my eyes and simply wait for it all to be over. I kept recording everything my sensors could gather, knowing that whatever came next would need to be reported accurately, in full detail, without exaggeration or careless omission. My hands were steady now, driven forward by professional discipline, even as my mind raced through a dozen unanswered questions at once. The raiders continued their approach without hesitation. The iron horizon remained still, patient, and utterly silent, its open weapon ports glowing faintly in the surrounding darkness of space, waiting for exactly the right moment. And then, without any further warning at all, everything changed at once. The first shot came so fast that my sensors registered the result before they registered the cause. One moment, the lead raider vessel was charging forward, weapons hot and aimed squarely at the fleeing transports. The next, its engines had gone completely dark, drifting silently off course, disabled rather than destroyed. I stared at the readings, running the analysis twice because I could not believe what I was seeing. No explosion, no hull breach, no debris field. The ship was simply, suddenly, powerless, tumbling gently through space like a toy someone had switched off mid-motion. "Report," Captain Vale snapped, his voice sharper now, all traces of earlier hesitation replaced by focused urgency. "The lead raider has lost all power," I said, still scanning frantically. "No damage to the hull that I can detect. Whatever weapon they used, it did not destroy the ship. It simply stopped it. Around me, my fellow officers exchanged glances, disbelief plain on every face. We had trained for combat scenarios throughout our entire careers, studied countless battle records from past coalition conflicts, and nothing in any of it had prepared us for a weapon capable of disabling a fully powered warship without so much as scratching its armor plating. The remaining raiders scattered, their tight formation breaking apart as panic clearly set in among their ranks. Several vessels attempted evasive maneuvers, braking hard toward different vectors, hoping that spreading out might reduce whatever risk they now understood themselves to be facing. It did not help them at all. One by one, with a rhythm that felt almost gentle despite its overwhelming precision, the Iron Horizon reached out and touched each fleeing vessel in turn, and one by one, they went dark and drifted quietly to a stop. I watched one raider attempt a desperate final maneuver, angling sharply away from the shipping lane and diving toward a nearby debris field, clearly hoping the scattered wreckage might offer some measure of cover from whatever weapon the Titan vessel was using against its companions. It made no difference at all. The disabling effect reached the fleeing ship regardless of distance or obstruction, and within seconds it too went dark, drifting silently to join the rest of its disabled formation. Whatever the weapon actually was, it clearly did not require a direct line of sight to function, which told me something important about the sheer sophistication of the systems humanity had chosen to keep hidden from the rest of the galaxy for so long. I counted 12 raider vessels in total, arranged in what had clearly been intended as an aggressive strike formation designed to overwhelm and capture the fleeing colony transports before they could reach safety. Within the span of perhaps 90 seconds, every single one of them had been rendered completely inert. Not one had been destroyed outright. Not one life, as far as my sensors could confirm, had been lost during the entire engagement. My mind struggled to reconcile the sheer scale of power I had just witnessed with the almost surgical restraint that power had been applied with. They disabled them, Ensign Kor said quietly, almost to herself. All of them, without harming a single person aboard. That is somehow more disturbing than if they had destroyed them outright, Captain Vale murmured, and I found myself silently agreeing with him. There was something deeply unsettling about witnessing an overwhelming display of power used with such careful, deliberate restraint. It suggested a level of control that felt almost impossible to comprehend. If they could stop 12 armed vessels that gently and that quickly, what exactly would it look like if they chose not to hold back at all? I turned my attention back to my sensor readings, trying to understand the mechanism behind what I had just witnessed. The energy signature had been brief, difficult to fully capture given how quickly it dissipated, but the pattern suggested some form of directed field disruption, something capable of interfering with a ship's internal power systems without physically damaging the hull itself. It was technology far beyond anything documented in coalition records, and I found myself wondering how long humanity had possessed such a capability, while quietly choosing never to reveal it to anyone outside their own borders. The colony transports, still shaken but very much intact, continued their course toward the safety of the inner system, their pilots undoubtedly relieved and confused in equal measure. I imagined what it must have felt like aboard those vessels, watching their would-be attackers so effortlessly neutralized by a ship they had likely never seen fight before either. Captain Vale ordered our own vessel closer, cautious curiosity finally overtaking his earlier instinct toward retreat. "Open a channel to the Iron Horizon," he instructed Lieutenant Arnos. "I believe we owe them at least an acknowledgement for what they just did." The channel opened, and once again Captain Hart's voice came through, still carrying that same relaxed, almost conversational tone that felt so strangely out of place given what had just occurred. "Windrunner, situation resolved. Colonist transports are clear and heading toward safe harbor. We will be recovering the disabled vessels shortly for processing. Thank you for staying clear of the engagement zone while we worked." "Captain Hart," Vale replied, choosing his words carefully. "That was an impressive display of restraint. Might I ask why you chose to disable those vessels rather than simply destroy them?" There was a brief pause before the response came, and when it did, there was something almost surprised in the human captain's tone, as though the question itself struck him as unusual. Disabling them means we can question the crews, figure out who is running these raids, and maybe stop the next attack before it even happens. Destroying them just means we clean up a debris field and learn nothing useful at all. Seemed like the more sensible option to me. The simplicity of that explanation struck me harder than any display of force could have. It was not mercy born from weakness or hesitation. It was calculated efficiency, a practical decision made by someone entirely confident in their ability to achieve either outcome and choosing the one that served the greater goal. I found myself scribbling notes rapidly, trying to capture every detail of the exchange for my eventual report, aware that whatever conclusions I drew from this encounter would likely shape how my superiors understood humanity for years to come. "Sir," I said, unable to keep the words from spilling out, "may I request permission to gather additional sensor data on the recovery operation? I believe understanding their retrieval procedures could provide valuable insight into their broader technological capabilities." Captain Vale glanced at me, a flicker of something like approval crossing his expression, despite the tension still visible in his posture. "Granted. Keep it subtle. I do not want to appear as though we are attempting to spy on an ally, even an unfamiliar one." I nodded, turning my full attention back to my console, adjusting my scanning parameters to capture as much useful data as possible without appearing overtly invasive. Over the following several minutes, I watched as smaller vessels detached from the underside of the Iron Horizon, moving with practiced efficiency toward the disabled raider ships. These smaller craft, themselves easily the size of a standard coalition patrol vessel, latched onto each disabled raider in turn, preparing to tow them back toward the larger warship for further processing. The coordination was remarkable to witness. Every movement appeared calculated, every maneuver executed with a precision that suggested extensive training, or perhaps automated assistance working alongside human crews in perfect harmony. I found myself wondering how large the crew complement of a vessel that size might actually need to be, and whether the ship relied more heavily on advanced systems or on sheer numbers of trained personnel to manage such an enormous hull effectively. "Lieutenant Arnos," I said, glancing toward the communications station, "has there been any indication of how many personnel might serve aboard a vessel of that class?" Arnos shook her head slowly. "Nothing in any records I can access. Humanity has always been fairly private about their internal fleet structure. Trade agreements cover commercial shipping and civilian exchange, but military details have never been part of any formal negotiation between our peoples." I found that fact more troubling than reassuring. An entire species maintaining such careful silence about their military capabilities, only to reveal, seemingly by accident during a routine distress response, technology and power far beyond anything documented anywhere in coalition records. It raised uncomfortable questions about what else might remain hidden, what other capabilities humanity possessed that the wider galactic community remained entirely ignorant of. As the recovery operation continued, Captain Vale made the decision to move our vessel slightly closer, close enough to gather clearer sensor readings while still maintaining a respectful distance from the ongoing operation. I used the opportunity to study the Iron Horizon's hull more closely, noting details my earlier readings had missed entirely. Faint patterns along the surface, too regular to be random damage or ordinary wear, appeared to be some form of heat dissipation system, likely necessary given the tremendous energy output the vessel clearly generated even during what I assumed to be minimal operational activity. "Sir," I said suddenly, noticing something unusual in my readings. "The Iron Horizon's primary power core appears to still be operating at only a fraction of its apparent maximum capacity. Based on the heat and energy signatures I am detecting, whatever we just witnessed represents only a small percentage of the vessel's true output potential." Captain Vale turned to look at me, his expression unreadable for a long moment. "You are certain of this reading?" "As certain as I can be without direct access to their internal systems," I replied honestly. "The disabling weapon they used against the raiders drew only a minimal amount from their overall power reserves. If they were to engage that vessel at full capacity, I genuinely do not know what the upper limit of its capability would even look like." The bridge fell silent again, everyone processing the implications of what I had just reported. We had witnessed a demonstration of overwhelming, precisely controlled power, and according to my readings, we had only seen a small fraction of what that single vessel was truly capable of producing. I thought of the confident, almost relaxed tone Captain Hart had used throughout our exchanges, and I began to understand it in an entirely different light. He was not being dismissive out of arrogance. He simply understood, with complete certainty, exactly how significant a threat his own vessel represented, and exactly how minor the encounter with the raiders had actually been from his own perspective. I thought of a phrase humans occasionally used in casual trade conversations, one I had encountered before but never fully appreciated until this exact moment. A slow day. This entire encounter, the appearance of an enormous warship, the effortless neutralization of a dozen hostile vessels, all of it likely represented nothing more than an unremarkable routine patrol response from humanity's own point of view. The thought settled into my chest with a weight I struggled to fully process, a mixture of awe, unease, and something close to genuine concern, though not concern for imminent conflict directed at us specifically. It was concern born from suddenly understanding how vastly we had underestimated a species we had considered harmless for years, without ever truly testing that assumption. Captain Vale finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than before, more thoughtful. "Corin, I want everything you have gathered compiled into a full report the moment we return to Coalition space. Every reading, every observation, all of it, without exception. Our superiors need to understand exactly what we witnessed here today." "Understood, sir," I replied, already organizing my thoughts, aware that the task ahead of me carried weight far beyond a simple mission summary. This was not merely a report on a successful rescue operation. This was potentially the first genuine insight the wider coalition had ever gained into the true military capability of a species we had spent years quietly underestimating without much real evidence to support that view. As the recovery operation continued outside our viewport, the disabled raider vessels slowly being towed toward the massive hull of the Iron Horizon, I allowed myself a brief moment to simply watch, setting aside analysis and observation in favor of quiet reflection. The stars outside seemed unchanged, the same distant points of light that had always guided our patrols through this region of space. Yet everything about how I understood our place among them had shifted in the span of a single engagement lasting only a handful of minutes. I thought about the countless conversations I had overheard among crewmates over the years, dismissive remarks about humanity's supposed luck, their apparent lack of ambition despite possessing capable technology, the general assumption that they simply did not have the strength or the will to become a significant power in this region of the galaxy. Every one of those conversations now felt embarrassingly premature, built on assumptions that had never once been properly tested until this very moment. Captain Vale ordered our vessel to maintain position at a respectful distance while the recovery operation concluded, and I used the remaining time to continue gathering as much data as possible, aware that every additional detail I could capture would prove valuable in helping our superiors understand exactly what kind of power now existed quietly along our shared borders. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a single question continued to surface, one I suspected would occupy my thoughts long after this mission concluded. If this display of restraint and precision represented only a small fraction of what a single Titan-class vessel could accomplish, what exactly would it take to see the full extent of humanity's true capability, and more importantly, what would it mean for the rest of the galaxy if that day ever truly arrived? A soft chime sounded from my console, drawing my attention downward. A new transmission request, addressed directly and specifically to our vessel, rather than broadcast openly across the system. I glanced toward Captain Vale, who nodded once, giving me silent permission to accept it on his behalf. The screen flickered, and Captain Hart's face appeared for the first time, calm, unhurried, and entirely unremarkable in appearance for someone who commanded a vessel capable of such staggering, quiet devastation. Captain Hart's expression on the screen was easy and unhurried, the kind of look I might have expected from someone discussing a minor scheduling matter rather than a captain who had just neutralized a dozen hostile vessels without firing a single lethal shot. "Captain Vale, thank you for your patience during that exchange. I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than through general broadcast, if you do not mind." "Not at all," Vale replied, straightening in his seat. "We are grateful for the intervention, Captain Hart. Those transports would not have survived without your assistance." Hart offered a small nod, though something in his eyes suggested he did not consider the moment worth much celebration. "Just doing what needed doing. I understand your ship was already inbound to check on that same distress call. I imagine this whole situation looks a little different from where you are sitting." "That would be an understatement," Vale admitted, and I caught the faint edge of dry humor in his voice, the first sign of the tension in the room beginning to loosen even slightly. "May I ask a few questions, Captain, now that the immediate danger has passed?" "Ask away," Hart said. "I cannot promise detailed answers to everything, but I will tell you what I reasonably can." Vale glanced briefly toward me before continuing, and I understood the silent instruction to keep recording every word carefully. "The weapon you used against those raiders, capable of disabling a vessel without visible damage to its hull, is that something common across your fleet, or unique to vessels of this particular class?" Hart considered the question for a moment before answering. "I can tell you, it is not unique to this ship, but I cannot get much more specific than that without stepping outside what I am authorized to share. What I can tell you is that we have found, over time, that solving problems without leaving permanent damage tends to create far fewer long-term headaches. Destroyed ships mean families with nothing left to recover, angry survivors looking for revenge, and debris fields that clutter shipping lanes for years afterward. Disabled ships mean we get answers, the people responsible face real consequences, and everyone else gets to move on with their lives a little faster." I found myself quietly impressed by the pragmatic reasoning behind the approach, recognizing it as a philosophy that prioritized long-term stability over any short-term display of dominance. It was a mindset I had not expected from a species so many within the coalition had casually dismissed as unambitious or lacking the resolve to be taken seriously as a significant power in this part of the galaxy. "May I ask something a little more personal?" I said, surprising myself with the boldness of the question before Captain Vale could redirect the conversation elsewhere. Hart turned his attention toward me on the screen, nodding for me to continue. "Given the scale of power you demonstrated today, and the restraint with which you applied it, I find myself wondering how your people manage to maintain such discipline. Many species who develop overwhelming capability eventually succumb to using it more freely, simply because they can." Hart considered the question seriously, his earlier easy humor fading into something more thoughtful. "Honestly, it is not always easy. We have had our share of conflicts, some of them costly enough to leave scars that still shape how our leadership thinks today. I think the discipline you are seeing comes from having learned, sometimes the hard way, that having overwhelming strength does not mean you should use it carelessly. Restraint is not weakness. It is understanding that just because you can end a fight in one move does not always mean that is the wisest choice available to you." Headquat. The channel fell quiet for a long moment, everyone absorbing the weight of his words. I found myself thinking about the countless dismissive conversations I had overheard among coalition officers throughout my career, and I wondered how many of them would reconsider their assumptions if they had witnessed what I had witnessed today, if they had heard the quiet, thoughtful reasoning behind a species so many had underestimated for so long without cause. Ensign Kor, seated at a nearby station, leaned toward me and spoke in a low voice, careful not to interrupt the ongoing conversation on the main channel. "Do you believe him, that this restraint is genuine, and not simply a performance meant to reassure us after what we just saw?" I considered the question honestly before answering. I do believe him, though I admit I am not entirely certain why. Perhaps it is the tone. A performance meant purely to reassure would likely have sounded more polished, more rehearsed. What we are hearing feels more like someone speaking plainly, without much concern for how his words might be received by an audience he has never met before. Kor nodded slowly, though I could see the lingering uncertainty in her expression. I suppose we will find out soon enough, once we are actually standing aboard that ship. Captain Hart, Vale said eventually, his voice carrying genuine respect now. I believe this encounter will significantly change how the Coalition views your people going forward. I hope that change leads towards stronger cooperation rather than unnecessary caution between our peoples. Hart smiled, though something more serious lingered behind his eyes. That would be my hope as well, Captain Vale. We have never wanted to be seen as a threat. We simply prefer to be prepared, in case circumstances ever require us to be. I think most reasonable people, once they understand that distinction clearly, tend to find it a lot easier to work alongside us rather than against us. Something shifted in the conversation then, Hart leaning back slightly, his tone turning lighter once again. Given the circumstances, Captain Vale, I would like to extend an invitation. Once the colonist transports are secured and the raiders are fully processed, I would be glad to have you and a small delegation from your crew join us aboard the Iron Horizon for a brief exchange. Nothing formal, just an opportunity for a proper introduction, given that our two peoples have apparently been sharing a galaxy for quite some time without ever really talking to one another. The offer caught me completely off guard, and judging by the expressions around the bridge, I was not alone in my surprise. Captain Vale hesitated only a moment before responding. We would be honored, Captain Hart, though I confess, after what we witnessed today, I imagine my crew will be approaching that visit with no small amount of caution. Hart's laugh came through the channel, warm and genuine, entirely unlike anything I had expected from someone commanding a vessel capable of such overwhelming power. That is probably fair. I promise the tour is a lot less dramatic than what you saw earlier. Mostly just hallways, quiet decks, and some very tired engineers who would love an excuse for a short break from routine maintenance. Something about the casual humor in his voice struck me deeply, more than any display of firepower had managed to. Here was a man commanding one of the most powerful vessels I had ever encountered, someone who had just effortlessly neutralized a dozen hostile ships without so much as raising his voice, and yet he spoke with the easy familiarity of someone discussing an unremarkable workday. The contrast between the terrifying capability of his vessel and the ordinary, almost friendly demeanor of its commander unsettled me far more than outright hostility ever could have managed. Captain Vale turned to address the bridge crew once the channel closed, his expression a careful mixture of professional composure and barely restrained curiosity. I will be taking a small delegation aboard the Iron Horizon once the colonists are fully secured. Corin, given your detailed observations throughout this engagement, I want you included in that delegation. I straightened immediately, surprised by the request, but unwilling to show anything other than professional readiness. Understood, sir. I will prepare accordingly. Beside me, Cor offered a quiet, encouraging nod, though I could see a trace of envy behind her expression as well. I understood the feeling completely. Whatever waited aboard that vessel, I suspected very few officers in Coalition service would ever have the same opportunity to witness it firsthand. As preparations began for our eventual visit aboard the human vessel, I found myself glancing back at my sensor logs one final time, reviewing the data I had gathered throughout the entire encounter. The numbers still felt almost unbelievable, even having witnessed the events firsthand. A single vessel, operating at what I now understood to be only a fraction of its true capability, had neutralized an entire raiding party without inflicting a single confirmed loss of life, all while its commander spoke with the easy confidence of someone entirely unconcerned about the outcome from the very beginning. The recovery operation finished sooner than I expected. Within the hour, all 12 disabled raider vessels had been secured within docking cradles that extended from the underside of the Iron Horizon like enormous mechanical arms folding something fragile against its chest. I watched the final vessel disappear into the shadow of the larger ship, and only then did I notice how tightly my own claws had been gripping the edge of my console the entire time without my even realizing it. Captain Vale ordered the bridge crew to stand down from heightened alert, though nobody seemed to relax entirely. The tension in the room had shifted rather than disappeared, replaced by a kind of quiet, uneasy fascination that I suspected would linger long after we finally left this system behind us. I flexed my fingers, trying to release some of the built-up strain, and returned to reviewing the sensor logs I had gathered throughout the engagement, cross-checking every reading for accuracy before finalizing anything for the record. I thought about the report I would eventually need to file, the careful, precise language I would need to use to convey both the overwhelming scale of what we had witnessed and the unsettling restraint with which that power had been applied throughout. I understood even then that this report would likely be read and reread by coalition leadership for years to come, studied and debated as the first genuine, verified account of humanity's true military capability, rather than rumor or second-hand speculation passed between merchants and border patrols. Outside the viewport, the iron horizon remained steady and quiet, its hull no longer glowing with active weapon emplacements, the earlier tension of the engagement having faded into something closer to routine operation. The colonist transports had resumed their course toward the safety of New Haven Colony, escorted now by a vessel whose true capabilities remained, even after everything I had witnessed, only partially understood by anyone outside its own crew. As our own ship prepared to close the distance and begin final approach for the promised visit, I allowed myself one final moment of quiet reflection, watching the massive vessel drift silently against the backdrop of distant stars scattered endlessly beyond it. Whatever awaited us aboard that ship, I understood that the conversation we were about to have would prove just as significant, in its own way, as the display of overwhelming power we had already witnessed together. Sometimes, I was beginning to realize the most important discoveries were not found in weapons, or shields, or engines, but in the quiet, unremarkable words of the people who commanded them every single day. Boarding the Iron Horizon felt like stepping into a story I had only ever heard secondhand, one I had never truly believed until my own boots touched its deck plating. Our small shuttle, carrying myself, Captain Vale, and 2 additional crew members, approached a docking bay so large it could have comfortably housed our entire scout vessel with room to spare. As we drew closer, I noted the same dark, light-absorbing hull material up close, its surface marked with faint scratches and scorch marks that suggested this ship had seen far more action than its calm, quiet demeanor during our earlier encounter might have suggested. The docking bay doors opened smoothly, revealing a cavernous interior lit by soft, even lighting that felt surprisingly welcoming given the vessel's imposing exterior. Waiting to greet us stood a woman I had not expected, introduced simply as Lieutenant Grace Bennett, apparently serving as Captain Hart's second in command. She wore a simple uniform, dark blue with minimal decoration, and greeted us with a warm, genuine smile that immediately put me at ease despite my lingering nervousness about the entire visit. "Welcome aboard," she said, extending a hand toward Captain Vale, in a gesture I recognized from limited exposure to human customs during earlier trade negotiations. "Captain Hart is finishing up a few things on the bridge, but should be down shortly. In the meantime, I would be happy to show you around, assuming you are interested in a proper tour rather than just standing around waiting in a hallway." Captain Vale accepted the offered handshake, his composure returning quickly despite the obvious strangeness of the situation. "We would be glad for the tour, Lieutenant. I imagine my crew has quite a few questions they have been holding back since we first arrived." Bennett laughed lightly, gesturing for us to follow her deeper into the ship. "That is usually how these things go. Everyone always expects something more intimidating, I think. Truth is, most of what happens on a ship like this is fairly mundane. Maintenance schedules, supply checks, the occasional card game in the mess hall when shifts run long, and nobody feels like sleeping just yet." As we walked, I found myself struck by how ordinary everything appeared. The corridors, while impressively spacious, lacked the imposing, militaristic atmosphere I had half expected walking in. Crew members passed us in the hallways, offering polite nods or brief greetings, going about tasks that seemed entirely unremarkable given the vessel's demonstrated capabilities only hours earlier. I noticed a group of engineers gathered near an open maintenance panel, casually discussing what sounded like a minor coolant issue, their conversation carrying the same relaxed, familiar tone I might have expected from technicians anywhere else in the galaxy. "It is strange," I admitted, unable to keep the observation to myself. Everything here feels so ordinary, given what this vessel is truly capable of doing. Bennett glanced back at me, her expression thoughtful. I suppose it would seem that way from the outside. Most of us do not spend much time thinking about the ship's capabilities day to day. It is just where we work, where we live for months at a time. The impressive parts only really come up when something like today happens, and honestly, those days are rarer than you might think, even out here along the border. We continued through several decks, passing what appeared to be living quarters, a recreational area equipped with simple entertainment systems, and eventually a large observation lounge offering a clear view of the stars outside through reinforced viewing panels. Captain Vale asked careful, measured questions throughout the tour, and Bennett answered most of them with the same easy openness, though I noticed she skillfully avoided providing specific technical details regarding weapon systems or defensive capabilities, always redirecting toward more general, harmless topics whenever such questions arose naturally in conversation. At one point during the tour, we passed a small viewing gallery where several off-duty crew members had gathered to watch a recorded broadcast of some kind of ball game, cheering and groaning at the screen with genuine enthusiasm. Bennett paused there briefly, allowing us a moment to observe the scene. "It is a small thing," she said, "but keeping some piece of home alive out here matters more than people realize. Long deployments can wear on a crew if there is nothing familiar left to hold on to." I found the comment genuinely illuminating. So much of what I had expected from a vessel of this scale involved cold efficiency, disciplined silence, an atmosphere built entirely around readiness and control. Instead, I was finding warmth, humor, and small deliberate efforts to preserve ordinary life even within an extraordinary machine built for war. It struck me as a kind of quiet wisdom, an understanding that a crew capable of wielding such devastating power needed, more than anything else, to remain grounded in something recognizably human. "Does Captain Hart join in these gatherings often?" Captain Vale asked, curiosity evident in his tone. Bennett smiled. "More often than regulations technically require. Honestly, he believes a captain who never sits with the crew eventually stops understanding them, and a captain who stops understanding the crew starts making decisions that get people hurt. I have served under him for going on 4 years now, and I have never once seen that principle change, even during difficult stretches." The observation added another layer to the picture slowly forming in my mind, one where overwhelming capability was tempered not only by careful policy, but by genuine, sustained relationships between those who commanded and those who served. It was not simply restraint applied from a distance. It was restraint built from the ground up, reinforced daily through small, deliberate choices that had little to do with weapons or shields at all. Eventually, we arrived at a modest conference room where Captain Hart finally joined us, exactly as unassuming in person as his voice had suggested during our earlier exchanges over the comm channel. He was younger than I expected, with an easy, confident bearing that reminded me more of a skilled tradesperson than a commander of one of the most powerful vessels I had ever personally encountered in all my years of service. "Apologies for the wait," he said, taking a seat across from Captain Vale and offering a friendly nod toward the rest of us gathered around the table. "Things got a little busy sorting out processing details for our new guests below decks. Nothing quite like paperwork to remind you that even exciting days end with something tedious waiting at the finish line." Captain Vale allowed himself a small, genuine laugh, the tension between our two crews finally beginning to ease into something more relaxed and comfortable. "I imagine that is a universal experience, regardless of species or rank." "Probably the most universal thing there is," Hart agreed, smiling warmly. "So, Captain Vale, I understand you had some questions for me, beyond the ones Lieutenant Bennett was kind enough to dodge on my behalf during the tour." Vale chuckled, clearly appreciating the humor woven into the observation. "A few, yes, though I suspect many of them will go unanswered, given the sensitivity of the subject matter involved." "Try me," Hart said simply, leaning forward slightly. "I will tell you what I reasonably can, and I will tell you honestly when I cannot." Vale considered his words carefully before speaking again. "The weapon you used against the raiders, the one capable of disabling a vessel without causing structural damage, is that a standard capability across your fleet, or something unique to vessels of this particular class alone?" Hart leaned back slightly, considering the question seriously. "I can tell you it is not unique to this ship, but I cannot get much more specific than that without stepping outside what I am allowed to share with an outside party. What I will say is that we have found, over time, that solving problems without leaving permanent damage tends to create fewer long-term headaches for everyone involved. Destroyed ships mean orphaned families with nothing left to recover, angry survivors looking for revenge, and debris fields that clutter shipping lanes for years afterward. Disabled ships mean we get answers, the responsible parties face consequences, and everyone else gets to move on with their lives a little faster than they otherwise would. I found myself quietly impressed by the pragmatic reasoning behind the approach, recognizing it as a philosophy that prioritized long-term stability over short-term displays of dominance or intimidation. It was a mindset I had not expected from a species so many within the coalition had dismissed as unambitious, or lacking sufficient resolve to be taken seriously as a significant power in this part of the galaxy. "May I ask something a bit more personal?" I said, surprising myself with the boldness of the question before Captain Vale could redirect the conversation elsewhere entirely. Hart turned his attention toward me, nodding for me to continue speaking freely. "Given the scale of power you demonstrated today, and the restraint with which you applied it, I find myself wondering how your people manage to maintain such discipline over time. Many species who develop overwhelming military capability eventually succumb to using it more freely, simply because they can." Hart considered the question seriously, his earlier easy humor fading into something more thoughtful and measured. "Honestly, it is not always easy, and I will not pretend otherwise. We have had our share of conflicts, some of them costly enough to leave scars, that still shape how our leadership thinks today, generations later. I think the discipline you are seeing comes from having learned, sometimes the hard way, that having overwhelming strength does not mean you should use it carelessly. Restraint is not weakness. It is understanding that just because you can end a fight in one move does not always mean that is the wisest choice available to you at the time." The room fell quiet for a long moment, everyone absorbing the weight of his words carefully. I found myself thinking about the countless dismissive conversations I had overheard among coalition officers throughout my career, and I wondered how many of them would reconsider their assumptions if they had witnessed what I had witnessed today, if they had heard the quiet, thoughtful reasoning behind a species so many had underestimated for so long without proper cause. "Captain Hart," Vale said eventually, his voice carrying genuine respect now, warmer than before. "I believe this encounter will significantly change how the coalition views your people going forward. I hope that change leads towards stronger cooperation rather than unnecessary caution between our two peoples." Hart smiled, though something more serious lingered behind his eyes as he considered his response. "That would be my hope as well, Captain Vale. We have never wanted to be seen as a threat to anyone. We simply prefer to be prepared, in case circumstances ever require us to be ready. I think most reasonable people, once they understand that distinction clearly, tend to find it a lot easier to work alongside us rather than against us in the long run." The conversation continued for some time afterward, touching on lighter topics, trade agreements between our respective peoples, shared interests between our two species, and eventually settling into the kind of easy, comfortable exchange that felt entirely removed from the tense, high-stakes engagement we had witnessed only hours earlier that same day. I found myself continually struck by the disconnect between the terrifying power we had seen demonstrated and the genuinely warm, thoughtful people who commanded that power with such quiet confidence. It was a contrast I suspected would stay with me long after this mission concluded, a reminder that strength and character were not always aligned in the ways one might naturally expect them to be. At one point, Lieutenant Bennett mentioned, almost in passing, that the crew had a small celebration planned for later that evening, nothing elaborate, just a shared meal to mark the safe conclusion of the rescue operation. Captain Vale asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether such gatherings were common aboard a vessel of this size, and Bennett explained that maintaining morale across months-long deployments required exactly this kind of small, regular ritual, a reminder that the crew remained people first, regardless of the ship they served aboard. I found the answer oddly comforting, another small thread connecting the overwhelming power of the vessel to the very ordinary humans who lived and worked within it every single day. As our visit eventually drew to a close, Lieutenant Bennett escorted us back toward the docking bay, offering a final round of friendly farewells as we prepared to return to our own vessel, waiting nearby. I glanced back one final time at the quiet, unassuming corridors of the Iron Horizon, trying to reconcile the ordinary, almost mundane atmosphere of daily life aboard the ship with the staggering display of controlled power I had witnessed only hours before during the engagement with the raiders. Whatever report I eventually filed, I understood now that it would need to capture not just the overwhelming scale of humanity's military capability, but the equally significant fact that such capability rested in the hands of people who genuinely seemed to understand the weight of what they possessed, and carried that weight with quiet, unassuming grace rather than pride. That combination, I suspected, would prove far more important for the wider galaxy to understand than the raw numbers alone ever could on their own. Captain Hart walked us the final distance to the shuttle bay himself, offering a firm handshake to Captain Vale before turning briefly toward me. "Officer Corrin, I understand you will be the one drafting the report on today's events. For what it is worth, I would rather you write the truth of what you saw than something softened for easier reading. We would rather be understood accurately than feared unnecessarily." I nodded, meeting his gaze steadily. "That is exactly my intention, Captain." He offered a small, genuine smile in return, before stepping back to allow our shuttle its clearance to depart. As the docking bay doors closed behind us and our small craft began its return journey toward the Windrunner, I found myself already composing the opening lines of the report in my mind, aware that the words I chose would carry consequences far beyond this single, remarkable encounter between our two peoples. The journey back to Coalition space took the better part of 2 weeks, and I spent nearly every waking hour of it compiling the report that I knew would eventually land on the desks of officials far more senior than anyone aboard our modest scout vessel. Captain Vale reviewed each section carefully before I finalized it, occasionally suggesting adjustments to ensure the language remained precise rather than exaggerated, though in truth, exaggeration would have been difficult given how remarkable the actual events had genuinely been from start to finish. I remember sitting alone in my quarters one evening, reviewing the final draft for what felt like the 100th time, when Ensign Kor stopped by, curious about how the report was progressing after so many days of steady work. She sat across from me, glancing over my shoulder at the display, her expression thoughtful as she read through some of the more detailed technical sections I had labored over. "Do you think they will actually believe this?" she asked eventually, gesturing toward the screen in front of us. "Some of the numbers seem almost impossible, even having witnessed it firsthand ourselves." I considered the question carefully before answering. "I think belief will not be the issue. The sensor data speaks for itself, verified across multiple independent systems aboard our own vessel. The harder question will be figuring out what to actually do with this information once it reaches the people who matter." Kor nodded slowly, settling into the chair across from me. "It changes things, does it not? Everything we assumed about humanity, about their place among the rest of us in this region of space." "It does," I agreed, though I am not entirely certain the change is a negative one. If anything, I find myself feeling somewhat reassured, knowing that a species capable of such overwhelming power seems to genuinely understand the responsibility that comes along with it. "Reassured," Kor repeated, a note of skepticism creeping into her voice. "You witnessed a single vessel disable an entire raiding party without so much as breaking a sweat, and your honest takeaway from all of that is reassurance?" I thought about how best to explain the strange, complicated mixture of emotions I had been carrying since that encounter first began. Fear alone would have been the simpler response, certainly, but consider the alternative for a moment. Imagine that same power resting in the hands of someone eager to demonstrate it, someone who saw restraint as weakness rather than wisdom. I think what unsettles me most is not the power itself, but how easily it could be misused by someone less careful than Captain Hart and his crew clearly are. The fact that humanity seems to understand this, seems to actively choose restraint, despite having every capability to act otherwise, that is what gives me some measure of comfort, even amid the lingering unease." Unquote. Cor considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly, though I could see she was not entirely convinced. I suppose that is a fair way of looking at it. Still, I imagine there will be plenty within the coalition who focus only on the power itself, without giving much thought to the restraint behind it. I could not disagree with her assessment. Fear, after all, was often a far more immediate and instinctive reaction than careful, measured consideration ever could be. I suspected my report, however precisely worded, would likely spark exactly the kind of anxious, cautious response Cor predicted among at least some segments of coalition leadership, regardless of how thoroughly I attempted to convey the nuance of what we had actually witnessed together. By the time we finally arrived back at Coalition Central Command, word of our encounter had already begun circulating through informal channels, exaggerated and distorted through repeated retellings among crew members eager to share their experience with friends and family stationed elsewhere across the fleet. I found myself summoned to a formal debriefing far sooner than I expected, standing before a panel of senior officials whose expressions ranged from open skepticism to poorly concealed alarm as I presented my findings in careful, methodical detail, section by section. The questions came rapidly once I finished my initial presentation, officials eager to understand every possible implication of what we had witnessed firsthand. How many such vessels might humanity possess across their fleet? What defenses, if any, existed against the disabling weapon we had observed in action? Whether this encounter suggested humanity harbored ambitions of expansion beyond their current modest territory. I answered each question as honestly as I could manage, though I found myself repeatedly emphasizing the same central point throughout the lengthy session that followed. "With respect," I said eventually, addressing the panel directly and without hesitation, "I believe the most significant takeaway from this encounter is not the raw power humanity clearly possesses, but the deliberate, consistent restraint with which they chose to apply it throughout the entire engagement. Every action I witnessed, from the initial engagement with the raiders to the subsequent conversation aboard their vessel, suggested a species acutely aware of the responsibility that comes with overwhelming capability. I do not believe humanity represents an imminent threat to coalition interests. I believe, if anything, this encounter suggests an opportunity for stronger cooperation, provided we approach the relationship with appropriate respect rather than the dismissive assumptions many of us have carried for years without proper cause." The panel remained quiet for a long moment following my statement, several officials exchanging uncertain glances before the presiding officer finally spoke up. "Your report will be reviewed thoroughly, Officer Corrin. I imagine this will require considerable discussion among coalition leadership before any formal policy decisions are made regarding our future relationship with humanity going forward." I nodded, understanding that the true impact of what I had witnessed would likely take considerable time to fully unfold, working its way through layers of cautious bureaucracy before any meaningful shift in policy or perception could truly take hold across the wider coalition. Still, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that my report, however it was ultimately received, represented an honest, accurate account of what our small crew had witnessed, free from the exaggeration or dismissiveness that had characterized so much of the coalition's previous understanding of humanity as a species. In the days that followed the initial debriefing, I found myself pulled into a series of smaller, more informal meetings with various officials, curious about details my formal report had not fully covered. One such meeting, held quietly in a modest office away from the main command structure, involved a senior analyst named Owen Bradshaw, a careful, precise man who had spent much of his career studying border relations between the coalition and its neighboring powers. "Officer Corrin," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him, I have read your report several times now, and I confess it has left me with more questions than answers. You mentioned that Captain Hart seemed genuinely uninterested in demonstrating dominance, despite having every opportunity to do so. Do you believe that attitude reflects official policy, or merely his own personal temperament as an individual commander? I considered the question carefully, aware that my answer might shape how this particular official chose to advise his own superiors going forward. I believe it reflects both, honestly. Captain Hart's own words suggested a philosophy shaped by past conflicts, lessons learned collectively rather than individually. At the same time, the consistency I observed, from the disabling weapon itself to the careful way information was shared and withheld throughout our visit, suggested something more structured than simple personal preference. I believe this reflects a broader, deliberate policy, one that likely extends well beyond a single captain or a single vessel. Bradshaw nodded slowly, making a note on the display in front of him. That is a more unsettling answer than a simpler one might have been, in some respects. A single captain with unusual restraint is an anomaly we could account for. An entire fleet built around that same principle suggests something far more deliberate and far more difficult to predict with any real confidence. I understand the concern, I said honestly, though I would gently suggest that a fleet built around deliberate restraint is considerably easier to predict and considerably safer to coexist alongside than one built around unpredictable aggression instead. If anything, I believe the consistency itself should be viewed as reassuring rather than alarming, once properly understood. Bradshaw studied me for a long moment before offering a small, thoughtful nod of his own. A fair point, Officer Corrin. I will include that perspective in my own recommendations moving forward. Thank you for your candor throughout this entire process. As the weeks continued to pass, I found myself reassigned to a larger coalition vessel, my modest role as a scout ship sensor officer suddenly carrying unexpected weight given my direct involvement in what many now referred to simply as the New Haven encounter. Colleagues I had never met before approached me with questions, some driven by genuine curiosity, others by poorly disguised anxiety about what the encounter might mean for the wider safety of coalition space going forward. I recall one particular conversation with a young officer named Ivy Calloway, recently assigned to my new posting, who approached me one evening in the ship's modest observation lounge, clearly working up the courage to ask something that had been troubling her for some time. "Officer Corrin," she began hesitantly, "forgive me if this seems forward, but I have read your report, and I find myself wondering, do you believe we are safe, truly safe? I mean, given everything you witnessed out there." I considered her question seriously, recognizing the genuine concern behind it, rather than simple idle curiosity. "I believe we are as safe as any species can reasonably expect to be, existing alongside a far more powerful neighbor. Absolute safety was never truly available to us, not before this encounter, and not after it either. What I witnessed gave me confidence that the power involved is being managed thoughtfully, deliberately, by people who understand the weight of what they hold. That is not the same as absolute safety, but I believe it is considerably more reassuring than uncertainty alone would be." Calloway seemed to consider this for a long moment before offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Officer Corrin. I think that answer helps more than you might realize." I found myself thinking often, during those following weeks, about Captain Hart's parting words as we had prepared to leave the Iron Horizon that day. He had told me, with quiet sincerity, that he would rather my report reflect the honest truth of what I had witnessed than something softened for easier reading. I had taken that instruction seriously throughout every stage of the reporting process, resisting any temptation to either exaggerate the danger for dramatic effect or downplay the sheer scale of what humanity had revealed itself capable of doing when circumstances required it. I thought, too, about Lieutenant Bennett's small, genuine smile as she guided us through corridors that felt more like a quiet, lived-in workplace than a warship preparing for potential conflict at any moment. I thought about the crew members gathered casually around that recorded broadcast, cheering and groaning at a simple game the same way anyone anywhere in the galaxy might, finding small comfort in familiar rituals even while serving aboard one of the most powerful vessels ever built. These small human details, more than any weapon or armor plating, had done the most to shape my understanding of what we had actually encountered that day. Standing alone one evening, several weeks after our return, I found myself staring out through the observation deck of my new assignment, watching the distant stars scattered endlessly across the darkness of open space. Somewhere out there, quietly patrolling the borders of a relatively young species, an untold number of Titan-class vessels likely continued their patient, restrained work, responding to distress calls, resolving threats with quiet efficiency, all while carefully managing exactly how much of their true capability they chose to reveal to the wider galaxy at any given moment. I thought about how easy it would have been for humanity to use that encounter as an opportunity for open intimidation, a clear demonstration of dominance meant to establish fear and compliance among the surrounding coalition worlds watching from a distance. Instead, they had chosen restraint, courtesy, and genuine thoughtful conversation, revealing only as much as circumstances required, while carefully avoiding anything that might reasonably be perceived as a threat by an unfamiliar audience. That choice, I had come to understand, said more about humanity's true character than any weapon or vessel ever truly could on its own. Overwhelming power, wielded carelessly, inevitably breeds fear and resentment among those forced to live alongside it indefinitely. But power exercised with genuine restraint, guided by clear principles and quiet confidence rather than any need for dominance, tends instead to breed something far more valuable over time, a cautious, growing respect that, given enough patience and continued good faith, might eventually blossom into genuine, lasting trust between two very different peoples. I did not know, standing there watching the stars that evening, exactly how the wider coalition would ultimately choose to respond to the information contained within my report. I suspected there would be those who reacted with fear, pushing for increased caution, or even open hostility toward a species suddenly revealed to possess far greater capability than anyone had previously assumed possible. I suspected there would be others who saw genuine opportunity in what we had witnessed, recognizing the potential for a valuable, powerful ally rather than a dangerous, unpredictable threat lurking along the border. For my own part, I found myself settling into a quiet, steady conviction, one built not on fear or blind optimism, but on the careful, honest observation of everything I had personally witnessed throughout that remarkable encounter from beginning to end. Humanity possessed power that could reshape the balance of the entire galaxy should they ever choose to use it without restraint. Yet they had chosen, consistently and deliberately, not to do so, and I believe that choice reflected something genuinely admirable about their character as a species, something worth cultivating and respecting rather than fearing without proper cause. Not long after that, Captain Vale himself was summoned to a separate hearing before a joint council overseeing border relations, and he requested that I accompany him as a supporting witness, given my detailed familiarity with the sensor data underpinning the entire report. The council chamber was larger and more formal than the earlier debriefing room, filled with representatives from several member worlds, each carrying their own concerns and priorities regarding what this encounter might mean for their particular corner of coalition space. One representative, an older delegate from a heavily fortified border world, pressed the question that I suspected many in the room were quietly considering. If this species possesses such overwhelming capability, why should we trust that restraint will continue indefinitely? Policies change, leadership changes. What guarantees do we actually have? Captain Vale glanced toward me before answering, and I found myself speaking before I had fully decided to. No guarantees exist in the way you are describing, Delegate. No species can promise permanent restraint indefinitely into the future. What we can offer is an honest account of what we witnessed, and a recommendation that we build our future relationship on continued observation and genuine engagement, rather than assumptions made in either direction. Fear rooted in uncertainty benefits no one. Understanding, built carefully over time, benefits everyone involved. 100 Ford. The delegate did not appear fully satisfied, but he nodded slowly, apparently accepting the honesty of the answer, even if it offered less certainty than he might have preferred. The hearing continued for some time afterward, though I noticed the tone gradually shifting, cautious optimism slowly taking root alongside the lingering unease that I suspected would never fully disappear from certain corners of coalition leadership. A message arrived on my personal terminal one final evening before I closed this account. A short, informal note from Captain Hart himself, forwarded through official channels now that formal relations between our two peoples had begun to take shape following the initial reports. He wrote simply that he hoped our paths would cross again someday, under far less dramatic circumstances, and that he looked forward to seeing what kind of relationship our two peoples might eventually build together, given enough time and continued mutual understanding between us. I read the message twice before setting the terminal aside, allowing myself a small, genuine smile of my own. Whatever challenges lay ahead for the wider galaxy, whatever tensions or opportunities might eventually arise between the coalition and this quietly powerful, remarkably restrained species we had so thoroughly underestimated for so long, I understood now that the future would be shaped, at least in part, by the kind of careful, honest understanding I had been fortunate enough to witness firsthand aboard that remarkable vessel. Standing there beneath the quiet expanse of distant stars stretching endlessly before me, I allowed myself, for the first time since that encounter began, to feel something closer to genuine hope than lingering unease. Hope that the galaxy, having finally caught its breath after witnessing the true scale of humanity's quiet strength, might choose wisdom over fear as it moved forward into whatever came next. Hope that the restraint I had witnessed firsthand might prove to be not an exception, but a promise, one both our peoples could continue building upon for many years to come. I closed my final log entry that evening with a simple observation, one I hoped future readers of my report, whoever they might eventually be, would carry forward with them. We had spent years measuring humanity by the absence of demonstrated strength, mistaking quiet restraint for weakness, and careful diplomacy for lack of ambition. What we witnessed at New Haven proved otherwise, decisively and permanently. The true measure of any power, I had come to believe, was never found in what it could destroy, but in what it deliberately chose to spare. And in that quiet, deliberate choice, I found more reason for hope than fear, as our two peoples stepped forward together into an uncertain, shared future among the stars.